When the cannons fired upon Fort Sumter in April 1861, people might have been shocked by the news, but they weren't surprised. By that moment, the Civil War had long begun to feel like an inevitability. Newspapers across the nation warned and worried. Politicians searched for answers to impossible questions, but they never found solutions. The country had been coming apart for years. States had been leaving the Union since December, South Carolina first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, one after another, a chain of departures that felt less like rebellion and more like a diagnosis finally spoken aloud. By the time Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president of a nation that called itself the Confederacy, the question was no longer whether there would be a war. The question was when, and where, and how bad. April answered all three. On the 12th, Confederate artillery opened fire on the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. For 34 hours, the guns did not stop. The Union soldiers inside had almost nothing to fight back with. Major Robert Anderson finally surrendered the fort on the 14th, but not before he ordered a 50-gun salute to the American flag, an announcement to the rebels that the battle might have been over, but the war was just beginning. Abraham Lincoln had inherited a country that was eating itself, and now, barely president for a month, he had a war to fight. Problem was, he didn't have an army. President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers from the loyal northern states. He asked them for 90 days of service. He said it wouldn't take any longer than that. The whole thing would be settled in 90 days. The call went out across every state in the Union, across the farms and the factory towns, the river settlements and the crossroad villages. The places that had been arguing about this moment for years were now asked to do something about it. Spring was coming on, but this spring did not come with its usual good feelings. The fields were thawing, and the trees were budding, and somewhere underneath all of it was a current of dread. America was at war, and its enemy was itself. The call landed in South Bend like it landed everywhere else. It came with a sense of shock, disbelief, and duty. Men enlisted by the dozens and then the hundreds. Proud South Benders marched off to distant battlefields and unknown futures in defense of a nation not yet 100 years old. Soon enough, they would become martyrs, heroes, leaders, and legends. Some of them would even get a street named in their honor. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going for a drive around South Bend to tell the important, zany, strange, and unexpected tales behind just a few of its street names. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in the series by the Doug Hunt family. In this episode, we are running down just a few of the South Benders who served during the Civil War and got a road named after them as a result of their heroics, their sacrifice, or, as we'll see in a little bit, because their last name fit neatly onto the county's alphabetical grid. We'll start with Oughton, a North Side road named after a South Side kid from a quiet family of farmers in South Bend. John Oughton grew up on a plot of land sandwiched between a set of roads that would later come to be known as Magnolia, Ireland, and State Road 23. Today, the old Oughton farm is a healthy stone's throw across US 31 from the Four Winds Casino. The land is largely grown over, marked with wooded lots and houses with gravel driveways set back into the trees. It's just about as far as you can get from Auten Road without abandoning a South Bend address. Years earlier, Alexis Coquillard had run one of his trading posts on the land that would become the Auten Farm, and besides an alarming number of rattlesnakes, the land would also turn up silver relics and Native American trinkets whenever the Autens were out to work their fields, which was often. They kept bees and nurtured peach orchards, and if the Autens were known for anything in the years before the Civil War, it was for those peaches and for that honey. At least until Lincoln made that call for volunteers. Little John Auten, now 21 years old, had already been the first one in his family to attend school. He was about to be the first one to leave the farm. He was also the first one from his neighborhood to enlist to fight in the Civil War. And before the summer ended, he'd be the first one to die in it. On July 9, 1861, John Auten felled a rebel soldier of his own, dropping a Confederate scout and returning to camp beaming and carrying a brace of revolvers he'd retrieved from his dead enemy. The next day, a similar set of actions would unfold, but this time it was John Auten taking a bullet to the chest and bleeding out in a Virginia huckleberry field at a place called Laurel Hill while his comrades returned fire. The next day, the Union Army would win a decisive victory at the Battle of Laurel Hill. By some accounts, John Auten was the first man from Indiana to die in the Civil War. By all accounts, he was the first from South Bend. The war would, of course, last more than the 90 days that Lincoln had hoped. By the time it ended, it was an unfortunate truth that people would more or less get used to hometown soldiers coming home in coffins, but not during that first July, not when John Auten died. Auten's body was sent back to South Bend for a public funeral at the courthouse. More than 5,000 attended the ceremony, more people than are supposed to have lived in South Bend at that time. Auten's body was draped with an American flag and dressed in evergreen branches. Inside his casket were the revolvers he'd won from the Confederate soldier the day before his death. By the time the war was over, trophies like these would no longer be buried in the earth. Both sides would hold tight to every weapon they could find. John Auten was buried in the South Bend City Cemetery. In 1933, more than 7 decades after the Civil War began, St. Joseph County renamed Army Road to Auten Road in honor of the first local martyr of the American Civil War.
Your attention, please. All hearers of this announcement are hereby warned by Father Soren that as of June 6, 1861, all persons not attached to Notre Dame are absolutely forbidden to fish or bathe in the lakes of Notre Dame. The authorities have been instructed to apprehend bathers on school grounds. You have been warned. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Norman Eddy is probably one of the most brilliant men to ever call South Bend home. Born in 1810 in upstate New York, he spent his formative years on the Finger Lakes, although it doesn't appear he took too much time to enjoy the scenery. He was too busy learning pretty much everything he could. As a child, Eddy was a voracious reader, consuming newspapers and leaflets and any book he could get his hands on. His appetite for knowledge followed him beyond adolescence, and the young Norman Eddy earned acceptance into Cazenovia Seminary, the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and a prestigious legal apprenticeship. It would have seemed the brilliant youth had a difficult choice to make. He chose all three. Eddy attended Cazenovia Seminary for a spell, then moved on from there to earn his degree in medicine. For his next act, he was going to get married to Anna and move to Mishawaka, where he would become probably the first medical doctor in that young city. He'd continue his practice in Mishawaka for 7 years, making it the longest job he would ever hold. In 1847, Eddy left medicine, and he left Mishawaka, moving to South Bend to launch a legal career, and after that, a political one. In 1853, Eddy won election to the House of Representatives. He occupied the same seat that Samuel Sample had held for 2 years a decade earlier. Norman Eddy wouldn't hold the seat any longer than that. There was a political steamroller behind him named Schuyler Colfax. 2 years after Eddy got to Washington, Colfax ousted him. That didn't mean Eddy's political career was over. President Franklin Pierce appointed Eddy as United States Attorney to the burgeoning Minnesota Territory. Eddy also accepted an appointment to serve as commissioner for the sale of Delaware Indian trust lands in Kansas in 1856. Back home, Eddy was mentioned regularly as a possible candidate for governor of Indiana. It doesn't appear that Eddy ever seriously entertained the idea. Perhaps he'd moved beyond politics. At the same time he was shooting down the idea of a governor's campaign, he declined an invitation from President James Buchanan that sought to make him an ambassador to the Netherlands. Maybe Norman Eddy was just ready to do something different, and soon enough, he would have his chance. As a youth, Norman Eddy had achieved success in every educational pursuit he'd ever attempted, save one. A teenage Eddy had been rejected from West Point, making the lack of a military commission the only hole on his resume. The Civil War was about to fix that. In 1861, Eddy was made colonel of the 48th Indiana Infantry and saw action in several key battles, including the Siege of Vicksburg and the Battle of Grand Gulf. But like most of his other jobs, Eddy's military career would prove to be a short one. During the Battle of Iuka, Eddy was grievously injured and lucky to survive. He mustered out on July 11, 1863, then returned to South Bend to make a third start on his law career, at least until politics came calling again. He spent a few years as U.S. Collector of Internal Revenue in his home district before the newspapers bandied him once again as a candidate for Indiana's governor, and eventually, its Secretary of State. The well-respected, polymathic, wounded veteran of a one war was a pretty perfect candidate. He won the office of Secretary of State in 1870. When he announced at the end of 1871 that he would not seek another term in that office, Democratic newspapers were hopeful that it meant a gubernatorial run was coming at last, but Eddy never got the chance. He died unexpectedly on January 28, 1872, and although he had been a doctor, a lawyer, a congressman, a secretary of state, and so much more, the newspapers would always remember him for his 2 years on the battlefield during America's Civil War. He would always be Colonel Eddy. The effort to name an Eddy Street came quickly upon the man's death. The first Eddy Street, of course officially called Colonel Eddy Street, was a West Side alley that was vacated, abandoned, and forgotten. In 1894, they dropped the Colonel and renamed the Eddy Street that still exists today. Colonel Norman Eddy is buried in the South Bend City Cemetery.
Do you like doors? Because even if you like doors, you'll love Irving A. Sibley. If you want locks to stay locked, even when babies are swinging from the doorknob, you'll need to visit Irving A. Sibley, where we hope you'll remember our door and open it often. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
It was 1933 when St. Joseph County endeavored on a massive project to rename dozens of its roads, looking to form a more sensible grid and to honor a few local and national heroes along the way. You're probably familiar with the naming convention around the county's roads, but if you're not, you're about to learn something you will never forget. From east to west, north-south roads are named after trees and plants in ascending alphabetical order. Every mile, the county road jumps to the next letter: ash, beech, birch, and bittersweet, cedar and cherry, dogwood, elm, fir. You get the picture. It's a good system, and it helps explain some of those weird road names you see when you get into the rarely used letters. Evidently, a Kenilworth is some kind of a plant. Then there are the other roads, the ones named after notable people from north to south in ascending alphabetical order. A comes first, and A is for Oughton, which is why Oughton Road is a north side road named after a south side kid. Brick Road is named after the congressman we talked about in episode 2, but not all of the roads are named after local figures. Cleveland Road is named after a president. Douglas Road is named after a senator from Illinois who looked a lot like John C. Riley. The grid runs out at Tyler Road, a president who never won an election and who was famously expelled from his own party while he was still in the White House. They're not all winners, but they each do a fine job of serving the alphabetical grid. My favorite is Quarles Road, named after a 17th century English poet whose most lasting legacy is that he was not very good at poetry, but they needed a Q, and Qs can be hard to find. If you were a local guy, and you wanted a county road named in your honor, it was helpful if you were either a significant politician or if you had served during the American Civil War. But it was more important that your last name started with one of the less competitive letters, like the letter E. Noah Early was not from Indiana. He had not been living in Indiana when the Civil War began. He would not even live here until several years after the conflict was over. But since the city of South Bend had already taken Eddy Street long before 1933, that meant the namers of the county roads needed another local Civil War veteran whose name started with an E. And that's how we got Early Road, named after a former member of the 99th Regiment of the Ohio Infantry, mustered in from Lima, Ohio. Noah Early had been born in Virginia in 1836, but moved to Ohio when he was still very young. In 1959, at 23 years old, he got married. When the war came, he did not hesitate to volunteer. The war years, though, were not good for Noah Early. He saw action during the Atlanta and Nashville campaigns, but was wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. What's worse, his young wife died at home while he was on the battlefield. Noah Early didn't keep diaries or correspondence that we know of, so we can only guess at his motivations, but after being wounded and widowed during the war, it seems likely that the man just needed a fresh start. South Bend, Indiana was as good a place as any for that. Early didn't quite live in South Bend, though. He remarried in 1872 and established a farm in Warren Township, which at least means his farm wasn't far from Early Road in Leidick. He had one daughter, her name was Emmy, and she married John Ziegler, the namesake of a once-upon-a-time place in St. Joseph County that aspired to become a village of its own, but never quite got there. Ziegler, in St. Joseph County, Indiana, still populates on Google Maps, though. There's not much that we know about Early's life after he arrived in St. Joseph County. He appears in newspapers just a few times, usually in guest lists at weddings and in his own obituary, dead on his 67th birthday and buried in the Portage Prairie Cemetery. It seems like there should be more of a story to tell, but there isn't. He wasn't a local kid when he went off to fight, and he never really became one of the area's notable citizens when he returned. But his name did start with the letter E. None of this is to suggest that Noah Early is somehow unworthy of a street name. He was a veteran who took a bullet for his country. He deserves the honor of a road name and more. But South Bend sent lots of soldiers to fight that war. Plenty took bullets, and John Oughton isn't the only one who died. The rest didn't get their own streets. Here are some of the names: Lewis Barr, Henry Johnson, Daniel Whitman, Joseph Casey, Henry Fisher, Henry Woolman, Benjamin Coonley, Henry Brown, Robert Wade, Martin Miller. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks again to the Doug Hunt family for underwriting this episode, and all 8 episodes in the series. In our next episode, we are going to visit a few streets with origins in the region's original people, the Native Americans who called this place home for centuries. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.